First off, Indiana Lyme Connect is a nonprofit with a mission to dramatically reduce tick-borne illnesses in Indiana. We do this in 3 ways. First, by connecting Hoosiers not only to information on Lyme disease, but also to research-based effective tick prevention strategies. Secondly, we connect Indiana healthcare professionals to accredited educational courses on Lyme disease and other tick-borne infections. And we also connect those suffering from Lyme disease to a compassionate support community. Indiana Lyme Connect, or known as ILC, is an all-volunteer nonprofit who depends on your donations. And these donations are tax deductible. Check out our website for the donation button and other ways to give.
Our speaker tonight, we're really excited to have with us Dr. Thomas Mather, also known as the Tick Guy. He has an impressive resume and is currently a professor in public health and entomology at the University of Rhode Island. He is the director for URI's Center for Vector-Borne Disease and its Tick Encounter Resource Center. His research interests include the ecology of blood-sucking arthropods and dynamics of tick-transmitted diseases. His outreach through the national prominent website Tick Encounter includes a variety of platforms for tick prevention education aimed at increasing tick literacy and preventing tick-borne illnesses. So sit back and enjoy his edu-training, as they would say, TickSmart presentation. We want to welcome Dr. Mather.
It's a pleasure to be with you tonight there in Indiana. I'm not in Indiana, I'm in Rhode Island. Hope everyone is doing well. What I want to talk to you tonight about is some TickSmart thinking and doing, and it'll become clear what that means in a second, but tonight we're going to focus on knowing the type of tick that might be biting you. And I don't know, maybe this is preaching to the choir because you all know what types of ticks are biting you now, but from my experience, and I'll be sharing that, this is something that's sort of a foundational thing when you want to talk about preventing tick-borne diseases. So hopefully everyone will learn something new tonight. Well, I guess it's good to start with bad news first, and hopefully we end up with good news at the end. But there are definitely more ticks in more places now than there were 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, and probably in Indiana, even within the last few years, you've been seeing more and more ticks than perhaps you ever saw before. And in this more ticks in more places world, CDC has estimated now, well, this is from, as you can see, 2013, that Lyme disease cases each year hits over 300,000. But just recently, they changed that estimate, and now it's up to almost 500,000 new cases of Lyme disease every year. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a problem. And it's a problem that is in desperate need of solutions. And hopefully tonight we'll just start on that path, and with the rest of your webinar series, you'll cover some more ground on that as well. This problem has come along, this more ticks in more places, at a time that you would think would be a good time because we have better access to information now than ever before with the internet. But unfortunately, at least from my perspective, so much of the information that people seem to get is a bit low quality information about ticks. It's a lot of second and third hand information that maybe just wrong enough to still leave them thinking that they know, but they are not doing quite the right thing. Maybe they're doing something, and maybe doing something is good. At least it gets you over that inertia barrier. But if you're going to do something, it's good to do the things that are most effective and maybe not just wrong enough. And I'll spend a little bit of time tonight talking about this concept of being just wrong enough. So people in the hood know things about ticks, that's for sure. Everybody seems to know something about ticks, but sometimes it's just, our goal would be to have it be just right enough and not just wrong enough. Because in America, what we've learned through a lot of different means is that there's a tick literacy deficit. People just don't know as much as they think they know about ticks. And so our approach has been to focus on many of those things that seem to be just wrong enough on our Tick Encounter website. And I don't know how many of you have looked at our Tick Encounter website before, but the Indiana Lyme Connect group is a prevention partner with Tick Encounter. So hopefully all of you have looked, but if not, please, I'll walk through some of the things tonight, some of the tools that you might not have noticed. But I have to tell you one thing right now. So these are the current way the first page looks. And in a few more weeks, it's going to have a slightly different look. So we are updating to Tick Encounter 2.0. Hopefully we can get it all launched in just a couple more weeks. And I think all of the things that people loved about Tick Encounter are still going to be there, but hopefully in a little bit more user-friendly fashion. So just giving you that as an FYI. We were talking about just wrong enough. And if you're not familiar with the blog section on Tick Encounter, there's a whole bunch of blogs that mostly I have written, some guest blogs as well. But I even wrote one about just wrong enough. And it sort of talks about the story of where this came from and some examples as well. And I'll talk about some examples as we go through the webinar tonight. To make it as simple as possible for people, this TickSmart actions. So we have 5 core actions that we think everyone needs to sort of do. But when we do survey work, we ask people, how many people do one of these things? And generally speaking, no one or very few people raise their hand. So my goal tonight is to get you to feel confident that you can do at least one of those things. And we're going to focus on this, knowing the kinds of ticks that occur throughout the year where you live and be able to identify them if they're biting you. Now you may say, oh, that's simple. There's pictures and everything, but it's not so simple. Like for instance, I wonder how many people even know what that kind of tick is. So anyway, don't worry about it right now. We're going to focus on that. And by the end of tonight, I'm confident that you'll all be tick experts. So knowing the type of tick that's active throughout the year. So that suggests that ticks change their activity pattern throughout the year. And that's exactly true. So you may or may not know which ones are going to be active in March and April, and those might be different than the ones that are active in July and August, and certainly different from the ones that are active in October and November. Some of you are probably already saying, you mean there's ticks still active in October and November? And yes, there are, and so we'll talk about that too. Well, why is it so important for you to know what types of ticks are biting and about different types of ticks, which tick it is? Aren't ticks all the same? But the most important reason for you to know is that different ticks transmit different disease-causing germs. And so we'll just take a look at the 3 most common ticks that most people in your area encounter: black-legged ticks, American dog ticks, and Lonestar ticks. So when we focus in on the black-legged ticks, they can transmit the germs that cause Lyme disease, human babesiosis, human anaplasmosis, a hard tick relapsing fever, and Powassan encephalitis virus. So one type of tick, 5 different disease-causing germs. We switch the picture to the American dog ticks. We also have to erase that list because they have their own germs, and they don't necessarily ever transmit the same germs that black-legged ticks do. So they can transmit the germ that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Rickettsia rickettsii, as well as other spotted fever group rickettsias that have long names that I can't remember all the time, but they don't usually cause people to be ill. But the spotted fever rickettsia rickettsii is it's a deadly germ. They also can transmit the germ that causes tularemia. Some people call tularemia rabbit fever. I'm not sure what they call it in your neck of the woods. But when we get to Lonestar ticks, which I know you have in Indiana, especially in the southern part of the state, we have to erase the board again because they have their own set of germs as well. So one called human ehrlichiosis, Ehrlichia chaffiensis, and Ehrlichia ewingi. They also are infected with another type of Borrelia. It's a non-Lyme disease causing Borrelia called Borrelia lonestari. We're actually not completely sure what that germ, if it does, if anything. They're also infected occasionally with Rickettsia rickettsii, the germ that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but they have their own spotted fever rickettsia that doesn't seem to cause disease. It almost seems as though it's a commensal organism in these ticks called Rickettsia amblyomii. But if you were to test your tick, it would come up as though it was positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So that can be confusing. And they also carry a protozoal disease called cytoxoon. It's not a human parasite, but it is deadly to cats. And so you probably should know that as well. Oklahoma and Missouri is a place where cytoxoon is quite common, not too far away from you. So knowing the kinds of ticks, that's the reason that we need to look at it, because they cause different diseases. And I like to start this part of our learning with the social media aspect of it. And so we have a Facebook page at Tick Encounter, and people sometimes will try and send us pictures there. We have other ways to send us pictures, and I'll share that with you in a few minutes that we'd prefer. But here was one. This was a woman named Liz, and I love Liz's story. So she sent this picture of a tick that she found behind her granddaughter's ear. Now, you can imagine how poor Liz, how anxious she probably was, because it doesn't look like the girl is much older than a couple of years old. And there's this tick. And on her watch, she was in charge of this granddaughter at this time. That's bad. So do you know what kind of tick is biting Liz's granddaughter? Do you know what kind of tick that is now? You can make a guess. I can't hear you, so you can be wrong, and I won't have to tell you that you're just wrong enough. But before we got to look at Liz's thing, a lot of her Facebook friends weighed in, and this is, I think, very informative. So her friend Carla here said that she's not sure what kind of tick that is, but they, whoever they are, say to remove, maybe that's the Indiana Lyme Connect people, say to remove the ticks and bring it to the ER or pediatrician, as they know and can also test it for Lyme. Well, I have to tell you, I've actually never met an ER pediatrician doc that wants to see somebody's tick. They are not necessarily trained as entomologists, and happily they generally know that it's out of their league and that it should go to an entomologist first. This friend Maha, she said that this tick is not a deer tick. I want to emphasize, not a deer tick. She's very bold, Maha is, and I like bold people. She says if the redness does not spread, she should be okay. And Liz says, I found it hard to tell looking at all the pictures online. So she's thanking her friend for that great information. It's a degree of assurance if it's not a deer tick. Her friend Elaine said it looks too big to be a deer tick to her. I don't know. How about you? Anyway, she hates ticks, so you can't really trust Elaine's opinion. And Paula, she's the best one. Deer ticks are almost microscopic. And so that looks like an ordinary tick to me. And I have to tell you, I've spent hours looking in journals for the genus and species name of the ordinary tick. So I'm not really sure what Paula is talking about. Unfortunately, all of these folks are just wrong enough. They have given Liz information that's not exactly right, because when we came on, this is what we replied to her. So this is clearly a female black-legged tick, and it's probably been there for about 2.5 days, just judging on how its size. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about this in a few minutes. And she should know that from where she is writing from, so we looked up on where she was by clicking on her name there, that about half of these ticks, 50%, are infected with something, in particular the Lyme disease germ, and maybe other germs as well. So half of the ticks. And this one has been attached long enough to have transmitted any germ it might have been infected with. So I'm sure that was fairly concerning to Liz, but she took heart. And you have to like people that have a positive outlook, because she looked at this 2.5 days and she realized she wasn't watching the granddaughter then. And so all of this tick biting stuff is on her mother, and she's actually the savior that came and saved the day by finding the tick. So we have this tool on Tick Encounter. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's called Tick Spotters, and it's a survey. And when we first started it, our goal was to just get people to send us their ticks so that we could see what ticks were out there. But the more we've done it, we have realized that it's really your portal to a tick expert. So all we do here in my group at the University of Rhode Island is ticks, and hopefully we've learned something over the years. I've actually been working as a tick biologist since 1983, which, you know, most of my students here at the university weren't born until like 1992 or so. So I get a little bit of credibility on that. But this is your portal to a tick expert. By sending us a picture, you start a relationship with us, and we hope that we hold up our end of the relationship. And I'll show you a little bit about what this is about. So here's an example of someone that sent this picture. So you have to take a picture that hopefully it's as clear as possible. We like to see the top side of the tick if you can. And but they often will write a comment. And so this one told us that this tick was embedded for about 12 hours, probably because that was when the last time they were outside. And that's generally what we find. But unfortunately, this tick has been attached for longer than that, probably closer to 3 days. And so this is a just wrong enough situation. So they may or may not know what kind of tick it is. They apparently didn't know. So that's one of the choices, I don't know. But they thought it was attached for not very long, and so they probably were less concerned about the germs that it might transmit. Here's another example. Here's something, this person took these to the doctor, and the doctor said emphatically that they were not deer ticks, and so to just use a topical antibiotic ointment. Well, probably most of you recognize that these actually are female black-legged ticks. This one looks like it's been attached for about 1.5 days. Maybe this one a little bit less, although it's a tad puffy there too, so it could just be slightly smaller. So I would have estimated that these ticks were probably on for more than a day, making them a little bit riskier if they were infected. And there's 2 of them for one. So if they were 50% infected, maybe 1 out of those at least is infected. But more to the point, the doctor gave them wrong information. So again, just wrong enough. So hopefully you're starting to see a little pattern going on here where, you know, everyone knows something about ticks, but unfortunately what they know may be just wrong enough. So here's another case. This one was one sent by a tick spotter, but they had already sent the tick to a testing lab. So I blanked that out so I wouldn't make anybody angry with me. But they said that this tick was a female Lonestar tick. And maybe most of you can see these 2 pictures down here. This is a female Lonestar tick. Doesn't really look like that. It's actually a male Lonestar tick. So even the testing labs that you trust don't always get it right. They also said this was semi-engorged. I would argue it's not really, because male ticks really don't engorge very much to change their appearance. And this was the thing that was most alarming to me, and it brings up what I was telling you. So they actually tested for Rickettsia amblyomyi, which I told you earlier was this commensal organism in Lonestar ticks, and it tested positive. And then they have this tested positive for Rickettsia species. Well, this is just a generic primer, so it will test positive for any Rickettsias, including the one that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which I don't even see on this list here, unfortunately. But so they call this, since it's in the spotted fever group of Rickettsias, even though it doesn't seem to cause disease. So this person came away thinking that this tick bite potentially gave them Rocky Mountain spotted fever, when really it was only infected with this commensal organism. So I just am telling you this because this was a case that is just a cautionary tale of some of the folks out there that are saying they're tick experts, but maybe not. So this is another just wrong enough situation. Some of these actually are a tad humorous. So this person said they found this tick on their butt cheek, but they don't know how it got there. Well, most of you probably have an answer for that. It climbed there, right? So sometimes even I can find the humor in other people's tick encounters. This is one that, again, you can see they thought it was attached for just 20 hours, but this, I pointed out that this person, you could see the anxiety of this mom who submitted this from her 7-year-old. So she has been worried all day long, wondering about this tick. And mostly what they're worried about is that they're going to get Lyme disease. So you can see this one was from Georgia, someplace in Georgia called Flovilla. And I hope that you can see that this tick has been attached probably for about 3 to 4 days, not just 20 hours. But the good news is it's a Lonestar tick nymph. And you already know that different ticks transmit different germs, and Lonestar ticks do not transmit the Lyme disease germ. So that, when we told her that, that relieved her considerably from her anxiety. Sure, you still have to worry about whether it might have been infected with human ehrlichiosis, but the risk for that is much less in ticks. It's at a much lower infection rate, so the likelihood of this tick carrying that is much lower. So another just wrong enough moment here. Well, so when we get these ticks, we've learned that if we don't get back to people within the first 24 hours, they kind of lose interest. If they or their kid doesn't start getting sick within the day, and then they find out 3 days later what kind of tick it is, they're already past it. So we've realized that we need to be prompt in getting back to people. And so we get back to them with a message that looks like this. It's a tailored message. So if that was a Nymphal Lonestar tick, we tell them that this was a Nymphal Lonestar tick and how long it had been attached for. We also tell them that it didn't transmit Lyme disease, because our experience has been that people are most concerned about Lyme disease when they think about ticks. Anyway, somebody out there might be asking, well, how is it that you know how long that tick has been attached? And so we have these growth comparison charts on Tick Encounter. Right now, they're under this tick identification tab. In the new version of Tick Encounter, we've called this Tick Field Guide, and so they'll be on the Tick Field Guide tab, but it'll be hopefully more intuitive. But you can see growth comparisons for many different types of ticks. Blacklegged ticks, American dog ticks, Lonestar ticks. Shown here are a couple different panels, and you can see that this tick and this tick are actually the same type of tick. They just look different. So ticks change their appearance the longer they're attached and feeding, and that kind of screws up people's minds, because they, if this came from your dog, this looks like it's a brown tick on your dog. So a lot of times people will say, oh, that's a brown dog tick. Here's an American dog tick that, is brown. And you may say, well, I can't really tell the difference. They all look kind of creepy to me. And so we're going to focus a little bit on that in just a few minutes. for instance, just to show you how tailored this is, so we've combined the risks in the second paragraph here, and a Lonestar tick can transmit these germs, and so we've talked about these germs already, but they also are associated in some people with a red meat allergy. Maybe some of you have heard that and are kind of panicked about that too, but other people haven't even heard about that, or they think all ticks can do that. But it seems, at least right now, for the most part, the red meat allergy only develops in people, and it's not everybody. In fact, it's a very minority group of those people that are bitten by Lonestar ticks. Well, before we go any further, we've looked at a lot of tick pictures, but I wonder if it's time to just take a step back and point out the things that a tick expert looks at when they're trying to tell what makes a tick a tick. And so a little anatomy lesson here. So ticks come in two body regions. A head region has a fancy name, but we will just focus on head, and a body. So two body regions. They also have 8 legs in the adult and nymphal stage size, and they don't have antennae. These things on the head region are called palps, and they serve to protect the biting part, which is in the middle. If you had a sharp knife for butchering, you would put it in a sheath to protect it. And so that's what these palps seem to do. All right, so here's something that's not a tick. It looks like a tick. People think it's a tick sometimes, but you can see that it has 3 body parts: an abdomen, something called a thorax, and then there's the head capsule. The abdomen has got segments in it, so you notice that the tick didn't have that, but that an insect does have segmented abdomen. And it has 6 legs instead of 8, and it has antennae, and actually you can see it even has compound eyes. So sometimes people might think these are just an extra pair of legs. If you look at it sort of that way, you might think that, but these are antennae. And so this is not a tick, but it is a bed bug, and probably, hopefully, you don't run into that very often where you live. But this is the thing that has been most interesting to me. When we show people pictures of ticks, this is what their eye sees. But what I want you to see is this part called the scutum. The scutum, or shield, is unique for the different types of ticks. You can see this one has a white pigment on it. So even when the tick is full of blood, you can still see the features of the scutum. And so instead of broadening your vision, as most inspirational speakers will try and get you to do, I want you to narrow your vision when it comes to identifying ticks. And so we have this tool on Tick Encounter as well that shows these are the 4 most common ticks that people encounter, the adult stage females. And you can see that they come in 2 different varieties: a plain scutum, these 2 on the brown dog tick and blacklegged tick, and then scutums with pigment on them. So this is just pigment in the cells of the scutum. And in Lonestar tick females, the pigment is at the back of the scutum. But in American dog ticks, the pigment is sort of diffuse throughout the scutum. Now, how am I going to tell the difference then between these plain ones? Well, so you have to add an extra feature. One, you can see how angular this scutum is and how rounded this scutum is. The other thing, so you can maybe notice on, not on this one, but on this, these little features right here. Some people call those eye spots. They're not really eyes, they're just spots, but some people call them eye spots. And you can see all 3 of these have those little spots, but this blacklegged tick doesn't have that spot. Also notice the blacklegged tick, if it hasn't lost its mouth part, has long straight mouth parts, whereas this brown dog tick with a plain scutum has short triangular shaped mouth parts. So when you point out all of these things that make it easier to see, I think my experience is almost everybody says, oh, I can do that. And I hope that you feel that you can do that too. So no matter whether the tick is flat or whether the tick is fed, you can always just focus on the scutum. So you can see here, here's the same thing with the blacklegged ticks. The scutum never changes in its size, even though the body increases in size as the tick feeds. So the scutum is a great signpost to guide us on our tick identifications. Now, when it comes to the difference between females and males, so all ticks have a scutum. It just depends on what size it is. So the female has a scutum that's only covers the first third of her body, whereas the male, the scutum covers the entire body. But look, it's the same color. It's made of the same components. It just spreads out over the whole body. Why is that? Well, the female tick has to take this large blood meal so that it can get enough protein to lay thousands of eggs, but the male doesn't have to do that. So if you were a Viking warrior, you'd love to be cover your whole body by a shield to protect yourself from incoming arrows like the claws of animals that are scratching you off, or the dust that may abrade your outer body coating and make you sort of bleed out from the outside, from the inside out. But this male doesn't have to take that blood meal, and so it can be covered by the shield over the entire body. And the same thing happens with the female American dog tick. Remember the pigment? It's all compressed on the shield, but when that shield expands, the pigment expands with it, and so you get a different look, but it's still a pigmented, diffusely pigmented scutum. And so that helps you distinguish between the female and the male. So if all of that little lesson fails, you can still always send your picture to tick spotters, and we'll get back to you confirming your ID in just 24 hours usually, or less. Well, so what can we do with this crowdsourced tick information that comes to us? We can build maps. So here's the CDC's map. And you can see this is the so-called distribution of black-legged ticks across North America. One of the things you'll find on the CDC website, and I'm not being negative, they have a great website, but their website shows this distribution no matter whether it's March or December. And so people might have the wrong impression that the distribution, this is where the possibly you could encounter black-legged ticks. But when you look at it from TickSpotter data, people's ticks that have been submitted, you can get a slightly different picture. Sure, the area that's covered is the same, but you can see that different seasons have different likelihoods of encountering certain types of ticks. And it changes depending on environmental conditions in those places. So this gives it sort of a spatial relevance of where you're most likely to encounter these ticks. And you can see it changes just a little bit depending on the season. The season is up here in the corner. Most importantly, I think it's interesting that in the autumn, most of the black-legged tick adults, you can see 80% of the ticks that are submitted in the autumn are black-legged tick adults, come from this northeastern quadrant and the upper Midwest in particular. Sure, there can be some in other places as well. Even Indiana has these too, but this just allows us to sort of see the nature of the tick distribution patterns. So let's look at Lonestar Ticks. So you can see you've got Lonestar Ticks according to the CDC throughout your state, but just north of you, Michigan and Wisconsin don't seem to have any according to the CDC records, but tick spotters have been finding these ticks further north as well, even into Michigan and Wisconsin. And so we're in the process now of sharing a lot of this information and seeing if we can change some of these maps with the CDC as well. We have the opportunity to look at patterns. So these are just an example of, in these 2 years, for instance, these were the zip codes. These are the first two numbers of the zip codes of where most of the submissions came from. So you can see some of the tickiest zip codes in the world in case you're getting ready to plan a trip or move, or at least in North America. And you're the first ones to get a chance to see this. So this will be a new tool that is going to be on the new Tick Encounter page when it is launched in a few weeks, called the Tick Finder Map. So it's a dynamic tool that you can click on a region. So I clicked on this for the slide, and I clicked on March. And then in this box, you can scroll up and down and see the ticks that you might encounter during March in this region. And hopefully, then when you click on these, let's say you wanted to click on this to learn more, it'll take you to this field guide that we have put in, and you can learn more about the level of risk. So you can see here, this gives you sort of a likely activity of this compared to other ticks in that time frame in that region. And it tells you that it carries 5 different germs as well, or in the case of dog ticks, 2 different germs. So hopefully you'll find this very, very useful. And you could even plan your summer vacations just by using the slider and putting it out. And maybe you're going to go someplace out here and you can see what ticks you might encounter. So we hope people find this to be a useful tool. Well, back to some of the findings from tick spotters. One of the things that we've learned is that over half the time, people don't recognize black-legged ticks, even though, you know, everyone's been alert to the fact that they're the ones that carry Lyme disease. But curiously, more than, well, 70% of folks didn't recognize correctly these Lonestar ticks. And you would say, well, how could they miss that white pigment? But it's really the male that they don't recognize, because when that scutum expands to cover the whole body like it does in a male, that pigment spreads out, and you can see that white pigment on the back margin of that scutum right there. Well, some of the other things that we find very useful about crowdsourcing this kind of information is, one, we get pictures of people's lived experiences with ticks. They're not always this way. Sometimes they're smashed in half on a napkin, but some of these tell a nice story, both in time and in space. And this one, for instance, you can see had almost 100,000 views. So people really took this to heart. Oh my gosh, I need to raise the hair on the back of my daughter too, because there might be a tick at the hairline. It's a great way to sort of nudge people along towards taking good TickSmart actions. This is just to show that you know, one idea would be to compile some of this information together. That springtime is the tickiest time of the year. This is the rough distribution of the types of ticks that people find. This is the distribution of the activity during that time. And here's an actual example of something with one of the memes that we have on our social media page. Another thing that we have learned, maybe you wouldn't have suspected this before, that about 5% of the things that people send in aren't even ticks. They think they're ticks, but that's because they didn't take this quick, short lesson that you're having right now. And this is just an example of some of the things that people find that they think are ticks. But if someone never told them that the thing that they thought was a tick wasn't a tick, they would go on believing that they had encountered a tick, and the next ache or pain that they had, believe it or not, they would be at a doctor saying, well, I had this tick and now I have Lyme disease. And so we can get people off of that just by helping them know that maybe what they encountered wasn't even a tick. So what is this? So here's exactly what we see. I found this tick in my laundry hamper. It was loose and wandering in January. Is that a tick? Well, you can count the legs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the other side. There's some antennae, and there's a head capsule, a thorax, and a body abdomen. This is a beetle, so the abdomen from the top is covered and you don't see the segmentation. But anyway, that's something called a spider beetle. And so this person, again, was just wrong enough to still maybe doing the wrong thing. They'd be thinking that they had a tick-borne disease when they didn't. So about a third of the ticks that are submitted through tick spotters have been attached for at least a day and a half. And we know the longer that a tick is attached, if it's an infected tick, the more likely it is to have transmitted an infectious dose of that germ that it was carrying. And so this makes a third of these ticks even more risky than people might think, because clearly a lot of times they don't believe that they've been attached that long. So this gives you an idea of what we were seeing in the fall of this past year. Too many ticks, too engorged from pets. Now, I know you're going to hear from a veterinarian in a few weeks, but this is what we saw. Too many of the ticks coming from pets in the fall were too engorged. That told us that the people who own those pets had stopped using an effective tick preventer. They thought tick season was over when the fall came. So these were all actually from 2 days in October. And so these are all ticks that have been attached anywhere from 3 to 4 days to 4 to 5 days on a pet. This just shows the information. So I thought, oh, maybe this is just a fall thing, but it turns out it happens in the spring and the fall too. But when we look at the data, so this is riskier ticks and less fed ticks, so lower risk ticks from the fall and the spring. But when we look at spring only, we see that in March and in April, that disparity between riskier ticks and less riskier ticks is much greater than it is in May and June. So people, I think, are seeing that in May and June, you can see the number of ticks on pets goes down as well. So they're believing that by May and June, they're starting to see ticks. They realize it's tick season and that they need to be protecting their pets. But my idea here of being TickSmart would be to set your pet up for some springtime success, because you can see that as soon as March starts, and we're starting to see that transition right now as the snow melts and the cold starts to go away, these leftover adult black-legged ticks in particular, leftover from the fall, are emerging and will be continuing to emerge all through the early and into the late spring. So you can see May ends up being the tickiest month of the year, but on pets, it actually goes down because by then people have started to realize that they need to protect their pets with effective products. So my argument is to be TickSmart, get started sooner. And so to help you with this is another new feature on available to you from Tick Encounter. You can actually get TickSmart messages, not every day, but 4 or 5 a month, and download them so that you can see them in your Google Calendar if you have that. And this is just an example of that. This also, this is what the new homepage will look like on the new version of Tick Encounter. And so all of these cards you can just click on and you can go to other sections. So hopefully it'll be easier to navigate. But why I have these two linked, you can read more about this Google Calendar in the current blog called What You Need to Know. So what I've learned, I used to do a lot of backyard messaging, and people would say, Doc, just tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. And so that has percolated in my head for a while, and that's where we came up with this idea for this Google Calendar. So hopefully you'll check that out on Tick Encounter and maybe add that to your Google Calendar, and always be ready to do the TickSmart thing at the right time of the year. So one of the things we'd like to know is if this kind of tick literacy training actually has an impact on people, and through Tick Spotters with that portal to a tick expert in particular. So here's an example of this woman who had sent us this picture in December. And her explanation is, when she learned about the fact that this was a black-legged tick female that had been attached for 3 to 4 days, she was already being TickSmart most of the year, but she thought that in winter the ticks were not active. And so she now realized that she could change her behavior. So she lived up in New Hampshire. So that was a great example of how the Tick Spotter, Tick Expert response has helped people. It's another great example. So I don't exactly know how this could possibly happen, but this would be 1 day's tick removal from these 3 beautiful dogs in the fall by this guy. And now he's happy because we told him that he might want to consider putting an effective tick prevention product on his dogs. And he did that. And now he hardly ever finds ticks. So, it's like, you almost like can't quite believe that people didn't know to do that. But maybe all he needed was a nudge from a tick expert to tell him that something that he should do. And he's happier for it. So what we've learned about tick spotters in particular is that it's a great listening tool to people's lived experiences for ticks. And we'd love to hear from more and more people in Indiana as well. So hopefully you'll spread the word about tick spotters and using this useful tool. But one of the things that I have found, that this may be this person's response, but this we have seen time and time again, that they've lived in the same house, the same town, the same location for a long time without ever encountering a tick. And now that is changing. Well, that just goes back to the way I started, which is there are just more ticks in more places now than ever before. And we see that even through this tool, Tick Spotters. So I'm just going to end pretty much there with the fact that this crowdsourced tick surveillance adds both seasonal and geographic relevance for people, both in space and in time. It can reveal people's lived experiences with ticks. And the good news is it's being revealed to tick experts, so we're paying attention so that we can guide the things that might be useful tools for increasing their tick literacy. And it's really a very useful engagement tool. I mean, when you get right back to someone, you'll never have someone more engaged to learn about preventing tick bites than someone who has just found a tick on their 8 or 9-year-old. And so they're paying attention and are ready to take action at that point. So it's a very useful tool as well. Anyway, I wonder now if it would be time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mathers. That was wonderful information. Very, very important information for all of us. I will give Dr. Mathers a question or two here to get started on as more may come in. We'll try to do the best we can to get through as many of them as we can. One question that came up is you had mentioned tick testing, that sometimes perhaps that is not as reliable as we would hope it would be. A question, I guess, that comes out of that is if you find, let's say it this way, if you find an attached tick, should you consider having it tested? And even though you were not eager to mention any testing labs, can you give us some advice on testing labs that would be good to consider? Sure.
So I think, personally, every tick presents some degree of risk, if it's infected or not, and different types of ticks, different risk levels, especially from different locations. But certainly if the tick has been attached for longer, the risk for it transmitting any germ it might have is greater. And so those ticks probably would be my first choice to have tested, ticks that have been attached for greater than a day or a day and a half. And so using tick spotters, we're going to make that estimate for you and give you some suggestion about whether your risk from that tick bite is low, medium, or high, because we already know where you're writing from because of your zip code. So for instance, black-legged ticks from the southeast, are less likely to be carrying Lyme disease germs than black-legged ticks from the northern and upper Midwest. And so the risk is a little bit different. And so we try to convey that kind of tailored information to folks. But it's really up to you whether you decide to have the tick tested or not. We feel that, if you have the money for it, you don't have too much downside as long as you use that interpretation correctly. So in the example that I showed, that would have put someone into panic. They would have then shown that to their doctor, and their doctor would have started treating them for Rocky Mountain spotted fever when there was no need for doing that. So it can get you, I would encourage the tick testing labs of the world to do a little bit better job with the interpretation. But if you combine tick spotters and the information that we give, along with maybe a tick test from a lab, then you're getting sort of the best of both worlds, I guess. We don't do tick testing at Tick Encounter. Just a decision we made early on.
Okay. And you don't necessarily have a specific lab or labs that you recommend?
So we have a few partners, and we will, in the response to tick spotters, we share a link. Right now, it's with COVID, it's been a little bit tricky. I think some of the labs that we normally would recommend seem to have shut down temporarily, at least. But there are a few others that are remaining open, and so we've tried to steer people towards that group until the other labs come back on. There's a little bit of a price difference. I don't know that the quality is that different. That when we've had examples of like the one I showed, we tend not to recommend that lab.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. We've had a question about tick removal. Do you have any advice regarding appropriate tick removal of an embedded tick?
Yep. Everyone should have a pointy tweezer, and we have a couple partners through Tick Encounter. One's called Tickies. Maybe you're familiar with Tickies. They're kind of a unique tweezer. It has a pointy end and sort of a scoopy end on the other end. It's a very fine tweezer. Another partner that we have called Mainly Ticks has a nice pointy tweezer that also works. That one has a little magnifying glass attached to it. So those are two that we can recommend strongly. You need a tweezer that's pointy, though. We have gotten with Tick Spotter so many pictures where people have, for maybe a size reference, or they just are showing us what tweezer they have these flat sort of pull your eyebrow hairs out kind of tweezers. And there's no way you cannot squish your tick at the same time you're trying to remove it with that kind of a tweezer. And so let's just back up a second. Well, why is that a problem? Well, think about that. If half of the black-legged ticks adult black-legged ticks are infected with some kind of a germ, and it's got a little straw-like structure called its mouth sticking out from the front, and it's in your skin, do you really want to squeeze the back end of that tick? I mean, think about doing that, like if you're icing a cake or something like that. Well, that's potentially what can happen. And so you really want a pointy tweezer that you can come in from the side, close to the skin as possible, and grab the tick at the flatter part, where the scutum is, or even the head, and pull it out that way. There's all kinds of, I have a shelf full of gizmockuses, as my wife calls them, of things, contraptions that people have invented. My favorite is one that is the size of a melon baller that has a trigger that sends a little electrical current, supposedly electrocuting the tick and causing it to immediately release. Well, it may work. Most of those things will work on male American dog ticks, for instance. Remember, they had short mouth parts. They don't really stay attached very much because they only have to attach long enough to take a little bit of a blood meal to stimulate their sperm to grow. And then their job in life is to wander around and find a female. So they're not really staying attached and feeding. And so they're ready to back out anyway. But a female black-legged tick, for instance, has those long mouth parts, or a Lonestar tick has those long mouth parts. And when they go into the skin, they actually secrete a cement substance so that they don't get easily removed, because their job at that point is to take a blood meal so that they can reproduce. And so they don't want to get brushed off, groomed off, or in any other way until they're done. And then when they're done, they actually secrete a little cement softener so that they can then pull their mouth part out and drop off safely. So those ticks are harder to remove with anything other than sort of a pointy tweezer.
Okay, thank you. There's been a couple questions about the use of repellents and treatments, both for your property, or let's say what to do in your yard to prevent ticks from coming in, as well as what to use on your body to prevent tick attachments. Any thoughts on that?
So I see that message here. So why should we consider a synthetic perimeter spray rather than a botanical or organic spray? And so my answer to that is, well, we've published one paper in the Journal of Medical Entomology on trials with about 8 or 9 different organic products compared to a synthetic product. And we found that for the most part, they weren't very effective. We just this past summer completed a study sponsored by the CDC that compared 15 additional natural products, botanical oils, and various other natural products. And again, found that only the synthetic products provided what we would consider an effective level of control against the tick. So our experience and with direct experimentation with these products applied in field conditions suggests that they're just not quite ready for the most part to be useful to actually protect you. So you think about it from the homeowner's standpoint, like they're weighing these two choices. Oh, I like green products. I'd rather have green product. Great. So would I, but I want it to work, because if I'm going to spend money and then send my kids out there feeling like there should be safe because I spent money rather than I know that that product killed ticks, that's another one of those just wrong enough. So you kind of made the decision to control ticks, but you've picked a product that may not be very effective. The one thing about the natural products that you should know is that they don't have to be regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And because of that, they also have never had to actually do validity testing. So our work, and some of this will be coming out in the near future as well, but the first paper is already out, and it clearly showed that there was one natural product that is not available as a consumer product right yet that was probably reasonably protective, called Nucatone. And so the people are still working on that. It's a derivative of Alaskan yellow cedar. And it's now being sort of, synthetically manufactured, but it's still based on a natural product. And we're hopeful that that will be something that will be a good tick killer. But in an early formulation, it was, but that is not available for commercial use yet.
Any suggestions on treated clothing, insect shielded clothing, permethrin impregnated clothing, anything like that?
Yeah, so we think people should use that. We've done, we had a large study that is just wrapping up now with the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health with outdoor workers. In that study, people either had treated outdoor working clothes or untreated, and then we evaluated across 2 years the number of tick bites and tick encounters that they had, and they didn't know what they had. I think probably some of them figured out pretty soon, as soon as they were standing next to somebody else who had ticks on them and they didn't. But anyway, it was found in that study to be about 65% protective over the long haul, which is, through 2 years of use, which is pretty good. We couldn't really control for whether the people had gotten a tick when they were off hours and not wearing their treated clothes, for instance. We actually couldn't even completely control whether they were wearing their treated clothes every day at work. But we tried. as best as we could. So, that's a very positive finding. So if you're more vigilant, I think, with wearing treated clothes when you go outside, I think you'll find a lot of protection. My one suggestion is that if you have a limited budget and you're thinking about whether you should buy a treated pants or shorts or treated shirt, remember that these ticks start low and crawl up. So I would go protecting myself at the lower levels first, and then worrying about the fashionability of my shirt later.
Okay, good advice. Then a couple questions about the Lonestar ticks. One is whether there's any emerging evidence that they could also be carrying and transmitting Lyme disease or other pathogens not yet thought to be carried. And then there's also a question about the red meat allergy and knowing how you're at risk for that or how you can be tested for that.
Well, so the red meat allergy, you have to remember, it's caused by an allergic reaction to a sugar that is secreted by the tick. The tick actually probably picks that sugar up, so it's in red meat. And when ticks, in particular Lonestar ticks, feed on a mammal, they would potentially ingest this sugar, and then they at least from what I understand, that in the digestion process, it doesn't get broken down, but it gets sort of changed a little bit so that it's from the red meat, but it's got a little bit of extra stuff added onto it. Just imagine we've all heard of the spike protein. It's not like that, but there's some change to that sugar. And so then that sugar is in the tick, and then the next thing that happens is the next time the tick is going to feed in its next stage, it's got this sugar inside of it and it secretes it in its saliva. And now that's introduced back into a person who then sees it. They may have never had a problem when they were eating red meat, but now it's been injected in them just a little bit different, and their immune system sees it. And so it doesn't happen to everybody. In fact, estimates suggest that only about 20% of people that have experienced Lonestar tick bite might develop antibodies to this alpha-gal. And even if you develop antibodies to the alpha-gal sugar, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to break out in serious hives or worse. There have been very, very few incidences of sort of a more serious anaphylaxis that has occurred with this. More often, it's sort of a gastric allergy then, and you feel sort of nauseated after eating red meat, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 hours later. So that's the way it usually presents itself. And it can go away. People think, oh, I'll never eat a hamburger again. But, sometimes spelling off of it will cause the antibodies that were developed to disappear, or at least be less present in your stomach where it would be causing the issue, or in your skin.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I covered everything that was part of that question or not.
Well, I believe one thing too that I'm aware of is that if you suspect that you have that, there is a blood test that can be done.
Yeah, so the blood test though can be potentially misleading. So you can test positive for the alpha-gal IgE antibody, but still not necessarily be one of those people that are going to be sensitive to red meat.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to just, a lot of times people get the bad news. Oh, I was positive for that. That should be coupled with sort of some symptoms. So if you have symptoms and then you get confirmed with the antibody, I don't think I'd go out and just get an antibody test first until you had symptoms, because otherwise you'll just panic yourself.
Yes.
I mean, it gets serious. I've had people say to me, well, I'm going to test it out. I've been bitten by a Lonestar tick, and I'm going to take my grill over to my doctor's parking lot and cook up a hamburger just in case. Well, that's not the way it works. You're not necessarily going to get that kind of, it's a reaction that starts to take place like any allergy over the course of time. Anyway, so it's not going to be like I was bitten by a Lonestar tick yesterday. Now I can't eat hamburgers without an EpiPen present, by the weekend. It doesn't take, it's not the way it works.
Yes. Thank you. We're just about out of time. Let me pose at least one last question here. There's been a question that alludes to the fact that many healthcare providers, get their information from the CDC on making judgments about how prevalent certain tick-borne illnesses are in any one area. And I think folks here in Indiana who have gone through tick-borne illness, many of them have had to deal with the fact that some of the CDC information currently does not list high prevalence of certain tick-borne illnesses here in the state, although it would seem some of those tick-borne illnesses are on the rise. I guess any feedback on, and it sounds like your center is trying to work on this, but to try to get the best information into healthcare providers' hands so that they know that, there might be Lyme disease here, even though they think there might not be.
Yeah, I mean, one way CDC is giving money away to states to do tick surveillance, and I'm pretty sure that Indiana is getting some of that. And so that's one way to do it. It's an expensive way to do it. So you hire people, they go out. Hopefully they go out to a broad enough array of places, but oftentimes they'll pick like a public park or something like that. And what if that place wasn't necessarily where the ticks were right now, but someone's backyard, half a mile away is. And so the value of coupling, sort of an active surveillance for ticks and a passive surveillance like tick spotters is that you just get more power to your surveillance, I think. And so we see, we don't always know, the people don't always know where they got the tick. That is a little bit of a limitation of our way of collecting ticks, whereas if you go take a tick flag out to the park and you get ticks, you know where they were. But I think that the most powerful way to do it is to combine these tools. And there was actually a recent paper in the Journal of Medical Entomology about that from the CDC, actually suggesting that there are ways with good quality passive surveillance methods like tick spotters to combine that with active tick surveillance to try and make that change. I know that that's an issue. Probably we saw it for a long time in Ohio, where the docs in Ohio would say, well, we don't have these ticks, maybe on the eastern border and maybe on the western border with Michigan, but in between, we don't really have that. And then we started, showing that we were getting tick submissions from people that hadn't traveled outside of the middle of that. And so we're slowly seeing the map of Ohio sort of filling in both from active surveillance efforts as well as our passive surveillance had already suggested that the ticks are likely there. So one of the things that we've done in a few cases with states and local municipalities is, alerted them to the fact that, well, we've had a handful of tick submissions from such and such a place. You might want to go there. So it might help better tailor the selection of sites for active surveillance.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll draw it to a close there for your time, Dr. Mathers. It was very, very helpful, I thought. So, and we've had several comments to that effect as well. So,
terrific. Thanks, Dan.
Very much.
And thanks everybody for listening.